Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I kindly ask you to come back to us so we can start with our next session. I hope you had some good coffee, some good conversations, and the chance to explore some of our key themes in greater depth. As you can tell from the letters, we now continue with our Kerbal Global Leaders Dialogue. At a time when human rights are under increasing pressure, from war to violent conflict to geopolitical rivalry, the need to defend universal principles is more urgent than ever. It is my great pleasure to hand over to my colleague Nora Müller, Executive Director for International Affairs at Körber-Stiftung, who will lead the conversation with Volker Türk, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Nora, the floor is yours.
Sarah, thank you very much, and a warm welcome to all of you. I am honored to be sitting on this stage with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Türk. Mr. Türk is now in his third year in this position. He spent the better part of his professional career in the engine room of the UN's human rights efforts, serving in distinct positions, including Under-Secretary General for Policy, Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination. Mr. Türk also has extensive field experience from all around the world, including Malaysia, Bosnia, and Kuwait. And for him, optimism is a strategic resource, I guess. So please join me once again in welcoming Volker Türk very cordially. Mr. Türk, let's maybe start with a very topical issue. The 28-point plan for peace in Ukraine that was put forward by the US was met with a lot of concern here on this side of the Atlantic. We talked about it at length already, but I'm interested in your assessment of the plan and of the human rights implication of that plan, especially when it comes to the demands for territorial concessions in Ukraine and the potential impacts of that for the protection of civilians. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to realize that the war has an incredible toll on the civilian population. And we have seen, unfortunately, and I always call it the illogic of escalation, we see an escalation as we speak. We see, if you compare it to last year, a 26% increase on civilian casualties this year compared to last year. We see the wholesale destruction of infrastructure, especially when it comes to energy. And that has a huge impact on the civilian population. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So whatever ceasefire, peace negotiations there are, they need to start with the impact on people. And I mean, we have the Security Council as a Women, Peace and Security agenda that was adopted 25 years ago. I wish we would not only pay lip service to this type of agendas, but we would actually live them. And I am afraid in the current negotiations, I don't see enough of the human rights content, of the fundamental human rights issues of the Women, Peace and Security agenda that actually should influence these peace negotiations, including when it comes to the direct impact that ceasefire negotiations have on the enjoyment of human rights of civilians, be it detainees, be it children, be it the prisoners of war, be it people living under occupation. And that needs to be coming out as well.
So could you sort of make that a bit more concrete? What would you want to see?
For example, an all-for-all exchange of prisoners of war. A very clear, I mean, we see systematic torture of detainees by the Russians. I mean, an immediate confidence-building measure would be to stop that practice, that they are actually released. A real effort to trace children and to find a solution for them. A stop to the indoctrination that we see on a daily basis in the occupied territories in the Russian occupied territories of the Ukrainian population. confidence building measures for family visits, for example, and so forth. So there's a lot that could be done that would actually build confidence. And, well, quite apart from the obvious one, stopping the attacks that we see escalating as we are meeting here today.
And do you see willingness to address those points?
I don't see that reflected at this point in time, but I hope it will come up in the negotiations.
We'll see how that goes. I wanted to broaden the picture a little bit for starters. And in fact, the picture is not a very happy one. The so-called rules-based international order is crumbling before our eyes. The human rights edifice is eroding. You mentioned that we're witnessing massive violations of basic rights in war, in conflict. So would you say, are we really on the verge of a new, pretty dystopian era?
I think we need to be very clear that what we are experiencing today in terms of erosion of international rule of law, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, especially in conflict situations, should concern each and every one of us. Because we may think that whatever happens in Eastern Congo has got nothing to do with our lives. We very quickly realize if you use an iPhone or a mobile phone, the cobalt and the coltan that is in there and the precious materials actually come from these areas. So there's a direct link with our daily consumption habits as well, quite apart from the horrible civilian toll that these conflicts have. I mean, let's go back to the beginnings. We had 2 world wars, we had the Holocaust, we had atrocity crimes being committed, and out of this emerged an international order with the UN Charter, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with a normative system that was established that states negotiated because they felt bound by an essential social contract and a consensus within societies, but also at the international level. That has served us well. Yes, there were lots of hiccups along, and not only hiccups, there were very serious issues along the way, I mean, including in Europe. I mean, just think of former Yugoslavia. But it was still the compass that helped us be guided through very difficult and turbulent times. If we lose that, we are at risk of a world in disarray, of turbulence, of confusion, of disquiet and disenchantment. And nobody can afford that.
No, that's certainly true. And you said something very interesting when you presented the Human Rights Report in May, I believe it was, and I'm quoting, the solutions to many of today's challenges, some of them you just mentioned, today's challenges and struggles lie in the principles of solidarity, equality, and our common humanity. In short, they must be based on a greater, not lesser, respect for human rights. I think everybody would agree with you when it comes to this call. But what's your expectation from, let's say, the government of this country, the German government, when it comes to strengthening and upholding that respect for human rights in a super challenging global environment?
I mean, Germany is a country that has full commitment to multilateralism. And it's a country that, irrespective of who is part of the government, has always had very clear support for the human rights cause. And we benefit from not only the political, the strategic, but also the financial support from Germany. And we need it more than ever, that's absolutely clear. I think it's more of a broader European issue. We have seen, you have mentioned, we have financial difficulties, that's absolutely clear. I mean, we are actually sort of on our knees when it comes to the human rights system in terms of funding that we receive, in terms of the regular budget that we have. So the question is, what do we do? How do we compensate for what we are no longer getting? And can we afford the weakening of the human rights system? And I think it's a question for all countries in the world. And I have had a lot of governments come and tell me that they're very worried about that weakening. I hope that Europe can play more of a champion role when it comes to this. And I think there is also within Europe perhaps not yet the realization that if you see a weakening of that system, that actually it will affect Europe in a negative way. And I hope that realization translates into politics and gives us actually more support at all levels. But yes, when it comes to Germany, we have very strong support.
So there's this realization needed that we are affected by these crises and by massive violations, even if they happen in places far away. At the same time, there is also a perception that we're sometimes very selective when it comes to our attention to human rights violations. Our political energy, our political bandwidth is limited. So is that something you believe that we just have to live with because it's a fact of life and it's the way a political system works? Or are there smart ways to maybe have a more comprehensive approach to human rights?
Yeah. I mean, I think the fact that we have 60 countries in conflict takes away a lot of energy. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. I mean, who can follow all these conflicts and see what it is that needs to be done in order to address them? I mean, Sudan is the latest example of it, but it's not just Sudan. It's, talk about Myanmar, that hardly ever gets mentioned, talk about Central African Republic, Congo, Eastern Congo, the situation there, talk about Colombia still, and many other situations around the world. What I think is important to realize that some of our long-term challenges, be it climate change, be it digital technology, have a fundamental human rights concern at their bottom. And not only a concern, but also a solution. Because the digital side, on the digital technology side, and I have had a chance to travel to Silicon Valley, to talk to the big tech companies. We actually have a project with them. It is clear that if you develop AI systems, for example, and if that development does not have the guardrails in place from the human rights side, and there are no human rights impact assessments or human rights risk assessments that are happening, you can actually create, and it goes back to the Sorcerer's Apprentice of Goethe, you can create something that you may no longer be able to control. Actually, Goethe, I think, was very ingenious in the way that he almost predicted precisely this phenomenon that you create something, you can't control it. And I think that's where human rights comes in, because it's essentially about power. It's about putting constraints on the exercise of power so that it allows freedoms to flourish and it pushes back against subjugation. But the same comes to economic systems. We developed this concept of a human rights economy. For instance, if you ask economists whether they ever studied human rights, I asked some of the very famous ones, and they said, no, it's the first time that they were confronted with human rights was when we talked to them about the human rights economy. And just to give you the example of Mariana Mazzucato, she developed this concept of mission economy. Well, I asked her, why can't you put human rights as the mission, instead of the enjoyment of human rights as your mission in any economic system that comes together? And she found that very intriguing. And she has actually written more about this now. But it also shows that we need this multidisciplinary approach precisely for the big challenges of our times. And we cannot insulate human rights into one corner. It needs to, actually, most decisions on women's rights, on gender equality, and on the promotion of human rights are taken in the ministries of finance. They are not taken in the ministries that deal with human rights issues. It's actually often where these decisions are really taken.
I'm glad you mentioned your meeting in the Silicon Valley, because I meant to ask you about it. It's, as you said, these are not two spheres that are meant to meet naturally. So I'd be interested, what kind of ideas did you come up with the CEOs?
So we have a privileged communication channel with them, especially when it comes to social media platforms, because of course, having a presence in 100 countries around the world, also gives us indication when we see an increase in hate speech, when we see incitement to violence, for example, or when human rights defenders approach us and tell us that they are under incredible threat. So we have this channel to make sure that something can happen. But there are lots of lessons to be learned. I mean, just to give you the example of Myanmar. In Myanmar, you had social, so it was Facebook actually at the time, where all the social media platforms took place before the horrible atrocity crimes that were committed against the Rohingya. The hate speech and the incitement to violence was on these social media platforms. So you need content moderation and you need proper safeguards in place so that these things don't become totally uncontrollable.
And what we're seeing is a rollback on the issue of...
And that's my biggest concern, that we see actually the initial realization that human rights are a compass and a guide and are the guardrails. There is less of that today. And as a result, of course, governments will have to come in. And we have seen it within the European Union. There have been a lot of, you have the Digital Market Act, the Digital Services Act, you have the AI directive. I mean, so there are a number of things that have happened, which are very, very important. But we need this, frankly, at the global level.
That's a very interesting point, and it fits into what we discussed in the beginning, namely a very fractured, a very divided international environment in which you have to operate. Here's another nice quote by you that I found. You said that given the dire situation that we find ourselves in, we need an all-out effort in screaming massive human rights violations are not acceptable. And again, who would disagree with that? But we also know that this all-out effort is not going to happen anytime soon, as long as the international community is as divided and as fractured as it is right now. So I was wondering, what is an effective human rights protection in this very difficult environment in which you have to operate?
I mean, there are different levels. There is the level of the daily work that is happening on the ground, but also that is happening with the institutions. The fact that we have 10 treaty monitoring bodies of the treaties, of the 10 major human rights treaties, has huge impact. The fact that states have to report to these treaties to experts and that they are reviewed and put under scrutiny has changed laws, has managed to make sure that certain issues are actually discussed. I have had a lot of government ministers tell me that when they prepared for this treaty body reporting, they for the first time found out about harmful traditional practices, for example. So it actually has this effect that you, because you have a system in place that tries to address this, changes things on the ground. My office got 3,000 people out of detention last year, because we have, in many countries, we are able to visit detention centers and prisons, and we identify people who are arbitrarily detained, or if you like, political prisoners, and we negotiate releases. Sometimes that's done publicly, sometimes, of course, most of the time it's not done publicly, because that's the one way to achieve that. We had about 11,000 monitoring missions. And in and of itself, that has a preventative effect. When we are involved in the commenting on legislation that is being drafted in countries that are contravening human rights law, again, it's done very often by having diplomatic démarches with governments and parliaments, but it is also done through the judiciary. We are sometimes making submissions to the judiciary to offer our expertise on whether or not this complies. And that is, very technical work, but it actually can do a lot when you suddenly have the abolition of the death penalty as a result, or when you have discriminatory provisions against women or against minorities being lifted, or when you see that because of your efforts, because also of your public statements, the situation is either changed or mitigated in its impact. And that's actually what also gives me hope, because we see, including among young people, an incredible yearning precisely for the type of issues that we represent. And especially in the Gen Z movements around the world, if you listen to them, very often what they are claiming for are human rights issues.
So there is purpose, there is impact to your work, obviously. Would you also say that the human rights pillar of the UN is equipped with teeth and are the teeth sharp enough?
I mean, there is, within the United Nations, you have a strong focus on the Security Council. And the Security Council, it is true, it is the organ that has teeth. There's no doubt about it. Sometimes I wish these teeth were used more and they were used in a way that they are actually being implemented, and there is a huge debate about that. But it is also true that the human rights system has some teeth. Because putting the public spotlight on situations in and of itself has a deterrent effect. The fact that you have a universal periodic review, where you have a state peer-reviewed process where governments actually scrutinize themselves, has also an impact on the human rights situation around the world. The fact that you have treaty monitoring bodies, the fact that we have 14 commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions has a hugely preventative effect. It also helps to document, and it also helps to, at some stage, use this documentation for judicial processes so that accountability is served. So yes, there are some teeth behind what we're doing.
And if you were a dentist and you could sharpen the teeth, what would you do?
I think the fact that we have universal jurisdiction increasingly in countries around, universal jurisdiction meaning that you can actually apprehend people who have committed serious human rights violations in other countries, and that you are brought to justice. Germany is a good example because you have universal jurisdiction. The fact that we need more of this is important because it fights impunity. The strengthening of the International Criminal Court, which gets attacked ferociously as we speak, which is extremely unfortunate, but the International Criminal Court, international criminal justice is very important because, again, I mean, you have seen the many indictments in relation to Sudan, Myanmar, Ukraine. I mean, you see it, Israel, Gaza. I mean, you see it in most of the conflict situations, but that is important because it is about individual accountability and a criminal process at the international level that the community of states has agreed to, and we need to use it. So I hope that accountability side actually is strengthened more.
I wanted us to also take a look at what some people would view as flaws within the system, within the human rights architecture of the UN. There's obviously the question of the Human Rights Council and its credibility, which is often questioned because states with not a perfect record when it comes to human rights do sit on that council. And there's also the issue of the council being seen as biased. What's your take on that question?
I mean, this is an intergovernmental body. I mean, it is true, in any reform of the Council, I would wish that there was more scrutiny of those countries that seek a election into the Council. There's no doubt about it. I also wish that there's a more strategic use of the different methods that the Council has. But you can say that about any body in the UN or, frankly, within governments and European institutions. And anyone should always look at how you can improve. At the same time, the Council has been extremely helpful in putting, as I mentioned, the spotlight on situations that warranted attention. We just had a special session on Sudan, for example. The Council created a lot of the fact-finding missions and the commissions of inquiry that look into very specific situations in order to also lead to judicial engagement at some stage and make sure that the accountability is served. The Council has created a lot of, I would say, state-of-the-art requests to us to work on neurotechnology and human rights, for example. So also discovering new topics where human rights issues are important. So I think, as always, you can always improve, and there's no doubt about it. We all have to improve constantly, but we should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think it's important to do that.
What about the question of bias? I don't know whether it's confirmed, but I believe that the council never formally condemned the terror attacks of October 7th. Is that right?
Don't know whether that council had a resolution on this. I don't know. I would have to check that. But certainly, I mean, when it comes to me as the High Commissioner, I did, because I sometimes see also all kinds of media reports that say I didn't. I've always been very clear about the condemnation of the attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups, as I have been about the conduct of warfare by the Israeli armed forces.
But the council is seen as biased against Israel.
There is that is often said. At the same time, we have a situation where indeed we have to deal with a horrible, not only the fact that we have seen the horrors as we are seeing them now, but also the fact that there is an unlawful occupation that needs to be resolved. So it does require international attention.
Let's move away from the Human Rights Council to another difficult issue. That's the issue of funding, really. You mentioned there the UN system in general and the human rights pillar does face a sense of crisis. So the human rights pillar is chronically underfunded, and key donors are now also withdrawing some of their voluntary contributions. So if you could share with us how that impacts your concrete work and what your ideas how to deal with that.
Yeah. So yes, I think we are in survival mode. My office, we had to get. First of all, we had to cut a number of our operations in very important parts of the world. In Colombia, for example, Myanmar, Honduras, Mexico. But also Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo. So a number of operations we really had to scale down. Tunisia is another, Sahel. So that has immediately an impact because we are very often the bridge between civil society, human rights defenders, the institutions of the state. And if you weaken that, the umbrella of protection that we often provide is no longer there, or is no longer in the way that it was meant to be. We had human rights. I remember indigenous representatives of indigenous peoples in Colombia, when we had to close some of our offices in very remote areas, they were desperate because they said, "Who is going to be here for us?" And it also shows, that type of impact directly on victims and survivors and human rights defenders, and that worries me a lot. And then there is the impact that it has on the fact that, for instance, all our fact-finding missions and commissions of inquiry are only functioning at 50% of the level that they are supposed to be functioning. So again, it means less documentation, it means less monitoring, it means less gathering of evidence. And the committee that works on the prevention of torture normally does 8 to 10 country visits a year. This year they were only able to do 4, which means there will be less scrutiny, and those who have an interest in the weakening of the system will be thrilled because, yes, it means that as a result we are suffering. We lost about a quarter of our income.
And obviously there are no easy ways to kind of fill that gap, that delta that is left by funds that are withdrawn.
And it's not, because there's always the emphasis on the United States. It's not the US alone. It's also a number of other countries in Europe have cut back on their voluntary contribution. So it's an accumulation of different things that has led us to this situation.
In addition to that, the whole organization, the UN, is undergoing the UN 80 reform initiative to become more efficient. But I wonder, how can you make sure that these efficiency measures do not come at the expense of protecting the fundamental rights globally?
So I think we will see whether there isn't a moment of truth at some stage, because there will be a threshold below which you cannot go, and it will affect the overall effectiveness of the human rights pillar. We are sort of on the limit there, I would say, at this stage. At the same time, I do see a lot of hope in digital transformation and innovation, but also in having a very serious discussion with member states when it comes to the many mandates that we receive, for example, from the Council. I mean, there is a discussion to be had on rationalization, and this is not an issue for us, it's also for member states, because they are the ones who create these mandates.
To tell them, stop, we can only do so much?
Redirect it and find a better way of, if you like, a more strategic way of dealing with the many issues that we face. And indeed, do we need 3 different or 4 different methods, or do we need maybe only 1 or 2? Do we need a commissioner of inquiry, a special rapporteur, and a report by the High Commissioner, or maybe we only need 2 of these? And I think that's more the discussion that we will have to have in the next couple of weeks and months, because yes, we have a certain ceiling and we are not going to be able to overcome that anytime soon.
We'll follow that discussion. As we're getting closer to the finishing line, at least of our conversation here on stage, and then open it up to our guests here in the audience, there is one question I wanted to address that I found very intriguing. You said in a recent interview that one of your fears was that we as societies are losing, and I'm quoting again, the very foundation that human rights are part of the social consensus in our society. You seem to perceive that there's a trend that the protection of human rights is seen as a question of ideology rather than as a fundamental sort of basis of our social contract, if you will. So what can we do about this? How can we stop or avoid going down that slippery slope?
I think there is an issue that in some quarters human rights are seen as an ideology, and that's very dangerous, because then it's basically a history lesson. It has never been and it will never be an ideology, and human rights are not for sale. They are not transactional. They cannot be part of a deal making. And again, it's important to go back to the origins of it. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted, as you know, it was the president of the Commission was Eleanor Roosevelt. She had to negotiate with her own State Department the inclusion of economic, social, and cultural rights, because it was already the onset of the Cold War, and at the time there was not much belief that, there was this dichotomy between civil and political rights on the one hand, economic, social, and cultural rights on the other. And she was the one, because when her husband was president, he issued the Bill of Economic Rights in 1944. So she really pushed that there is an inclusion of economic, social, and cultural rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's also interesting that it was an Indian feminist, Hansa Mehta, who made sure that the Article 1 doesn't say all men are born free and equal in dignity, and are born free and equal in dignity and rights, but all human beings are born free and equal. And it was a Pakistani feminist who made sure that gender, marriage, there was equality when it comes to marriage. So it's interesting to go back to that history and to see how that normative system was nourished by different experiences, by 9 women, by the way. We often hear about men, but we had 9 women who helped develop the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And from different cultures, because sometimes there is this thing, it's, the universality of it, it's a Western product. No, actually that's not true at all. And we need to go back to understanding why this document is so foundational for any society, because it allows for a discussion to have about the big challenges and the tensions and the dilemmas that we face in our societies today, and how to tackle also and find solutions to the big challenges of the future.
I guess here private foundations can also play a role.
Absolutely.
But I have one final question for you, Mr. Turk, before I open it up for questions from the floor. The current Secretary General of NATO, Antonio Guterres, will be in office until...
Of United Nations.
Excuse me,
You
what did
said
I say?
NATO.
Oh, okay, sorry, misspoke. Of
The UN.
He will be in office until December next year. We don't know yet who his successor is going to be, but what is your advice to her?
Well, first of all, it is absolutely clear that the UN is at an important inflection point. And it's also good to read the Charter very carefully, because the Charter is quite a marvelous document. And sometimes we hear, let's focus on peace and security, because that's the original intent of the Charter. Well, the Charter also talked about economic, social development, it talked about human rights. So the Charter is really the foundation. I would advise her to read the Charter very carefully, not to shy away from fundamental reforms, and that's a dialogue with member states, but also to make sure that the pillars that we have within the United Nations, which is of course peace and security, which is development, sustainable development, which is human rights, and the humanitarian work of the office, that interconnection between all four of them is going to be the big challenge of the future, because we sometimes fall into this siloed thinking. And sometimes even in peace negotiations, as we just saw, it is only seen as politics when it comes to ceasefire, peace negotiations. No, you have to bring in you have to think about the development, you have to think about the human rights dimension, you have to think about the humanitarian dimension. And to bring in a more interconnected view is going to be extremely important.
We'll follow that issue as well. Thank you so much for now. Now, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's your turn. I see a number of hands going up. That's fantastic. You know the drill by now. Please briefly introduce yourselves and then pose a question. And the question should have a question mark at the end, ideally. So, Yigal Stanovsky was first, I believe. And the mic is coming.
I can take a couple of them if you want. I can take a few if you want, as you wish.
Yigal Ostanovsky-Katz from Israel. You lamented, Sir High Commissioner, the weakening of the human rights agenda, and I subscribe fully to both the observation and the feeling about the state of human rights agenda and norms. But was there, and that's my question, a reflective process about the sources, or some of the sources, of this reality, and in particular cases of selective and biased application of human rights agenda, of the Council of Human Rights, being laser focused on certain countries, or should I say a certain country, and in general weaponizing human rights agenda for political purposes by countries who have in reality zero regard to human rights in their internal or regional policies, like Iran. And if this is the case, what procedural defenses could be put in place to prevent that from happening? Thank you.
Well, I can tell you that the Human Rights Council, I just arrived actually as High Commissioner. We had a special session on the human rights situation in Iran in 22, in November. I think it was November, end of November 22, or beginning of December, because of, as you know, there were these demonstrations, there were the suppression after the killing of one of the female demonstrators. There were the whole issue of gender equality. So I think you should really have a look at the many countries and topics that are actually being discussed in the Human Rights Council, because it covers, I would say, almost all the situations that we have currently under scrutiny. And if they don't, my office will.
I have a second question over there. I think it's Olga, if I'm not mistaken.
Hello, my name is Olga Sitnik, and I work for UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. So I'm very happy that UN topic is covered today. And that's why I hope it's okay that it will be related to asylum systems and so on. And of course, the statement about the funding was something that is also touching us a lot, as all other UN agencies. We also closing operations and not providing this so much needed help to the people in need. But my question is, so in many countries, also in my region, also in Scandinavia, we see that asylum systems are becoming more restrictive. And what do you think, what human rights arguments or tools do you consider most effective in engaging governments to keep asylum space open? Thank you.
Well, I mean, obviously UNHCR is at the heart of precisely these issues. As you know, I have had a long engagement with UNHCR, I mean, with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and it is very important to, again, recall that we had a very intense process of working out two compacts, the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. And the Global Compact on Refugees actually really offers a responsibility sharing model, both for the major host countries around the world, because I sometimes listen to the discussion in Europe, and I'm not denying the difficulties around it, but when I sometimes listen to the discussion in Europe, you have the impression that this is not at all comparable to, for instance, now Chad having to receive hundreds of thousands of Sudanese refugees. The same with South Sudan, the same with Uganda, the same with the various Venezuelan refugees and asylum seekers in Latin America. So sometimes fear that we should really look at it from a responsibility sharing perspective, including when it comes to asylum systems. And the right to asylum is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's one of the fundamental rights. It's Article 14. It also emerged, not least as a result of the experience during the Second World War, when many Jews, many political opponents were either returned, pushed back, and ended up at serious risk. So we need to recall what, again, the origin of the right to asylum is, and we need to honor and treasure it as really one of our hallmarks of our system to protect human rights. And it's really important. Sometimes I find the discussion almost too emotional and not necessarily based on evidence and facts and finding a solution to managing these systems.
I think there was a question on this side of the room, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, over here. Two questions over there. The mic is coming.
Hello, my name is Nehia Ayral, and I'm a children's rights advocate, especially focusing on combating corporal punishment. And I spent the past year contacting basically every UN organization, and one of them being your office and the Human Rights Council. And my goal was to bring this issue to the global stage of corporal punishment. And I've been told by basically everyone that that's not possible because of the very rigid structures of the UN, because of the lack of liquidity, and also that there's always a set agenda and that there's nothing you can do about that. And before something becomes a special session, that there has to be a massive international uproar. And I found it quite interesting, and also that you mentioned Sudan and how the Human Rights Council and your office brought attention to this issue. But it hasn't been like that in my experience. That's easy to bring issues forward which need this global attention and the legitimacy those issues get by bringing them to the global stage through the United Nations. And my question is, how can we bring issues forward, human rights matters, human rights violations, without massive atrocities having to happen first? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe because we have only less than 5 minutes to go, we'll take the second question with the first one, and our colleague from Argentina is next.
Yeah, I'm Lila Roldán Vázquez from Argentine Council for International Relations. Regarding the question of Ukrainian children abducted by Russia, would you comment on and if your office is doing something? What kind of work are you doing regarding this question? Because I understand that the UN Office for Children in Conflict is focusing mainly on African children, with rightly doing so, and soldiers' children and all that. But I'm very worried about the situation of thousands of children in Russia right now.
So I will start with the last question. Obviously, this is one of those issues that need to go into the negotiations in the ceasefire and in the peace agreement. And yes, we have followed this very closely. As you know, I have an office in Ukraine. We have been there since 2014. We have worked with the Ukrainian authorities. We are not present in the Russian Federation, so that's why we are operationally not able to deal with this on the other side. But we are working with the Ukrainian authorities, especially on the documenting of this particular issue. But I do know that you mentioned the Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict. She has been involved as well. It's not only that she's focusing on situations in Africa. She also has been engaged on this particular issue. I think, again, it's important to make a distinction between the processes at the intergovernmental level when it comes to the Human Rights Council and when it comes to my office. I can assure you that the issue of corporal punishment is a UN-wide issue that is addressed. It's not only part, if you like, of the work of UNICEF, it's also part of our own advocacy and our own commenting when it comes to legislative and policy initiatives in countries. That's one thing, and it's important to bear that in mind. What the Council then does and what the Council puts up within its agenda is a discussion that member states have among themselves. I would not know whether, I would have to check whether at any point in time this has been a discussion, but we had a child rights mainstreaming initiative that does address especially issues of physical violence, including, of course, there's a whole committee on the rights of the child that deals with this issue when they review state reports. So there is a response from the human rights system to this particular issue because it's a child rights violation. Good.
Well, we're almost at the end of this very intriguing conversation. Thank you very much, Mr. Türk, for your time and for the insightful comments you shared with us. Of course, we wish you the best of success for your important work in very challenging circumstances. And most of all, please do stay optimistic. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Great.